while we wait until some other people join, some of you might know James, but I only met James a couple months ago. But I'm curious, James, could you explain who the man behind this wonderful beard is?
Yes, I can. So if I start before I had the beard, if that's okay with you, Nick. So I am an open source contributor. I'm working in NatWest, so I'm head of open source in NatWest. But I've been part of the open source community as bringing together the JavaScript community within London, probably for nearly 10 years now. So my entry point into open source was by bringing groups of engineers together to learn about JavaScript, because a lot of the frameworks around the JavaScript ecosystem are actually contributed through open source. And at that point in time, I used to be a .NET developer, and so everything was handed to us through MSDN and Microsoft. But the world was shifting, and there was a real shift from that Microsoft ecosystem into an ecosystem of Apache 2 and MIT. And that caused us a few problems, within the engineering community, because the open source community comes together in order to educate each other. And so we found that enterprise engineers who were contributing into enterprise banks had a bit of a gap between understanding the latest JavaScript frameworks and being able to contribute into banking solutions. And so I created, at that time, it was a React JS community in London that has recently changed to London JS. And we now have 4,500 members, where we come together to talk about, open source frameworks and, the React, the JavaScript ecosystem in general. But that was my first kind of like entry point into open source. And then from there, I started applying that inside my day job. So I was a consultant. Then I moved into becoming an engineering lead at Lloyds Banking Group. And then I joined the Linux Foundation in order to hone my open source craft. And so I was part of the FINOS team as director of community. And then 18 months ago, I moved outside of the Linux Foundation back into banking. And I'm now leading open source for NatWest Group. And so that's the man behind the beard. And in between that start point and where I am now, I do have a beard, which was like a post-COVID thing. There are still photos of me pre-beard out there if you want to search.
We found one previous without beard. We don't have it on the slide. We're not that prepared. But Raymond found one without, and he was like, wow, okay. But as you notice, he's also very colorful. Has the same shirt on this picture, so that's appropriate.
Yeah, that photo was taken at an open source summit in Bilbao, maybe a year or so ago, and it's kind of come on my travels with me since then. So Nick, so tell me, what does being director of contributor success at GitLab mean?
It's a very good question. So maybe to unpack a couple of those words, who of you know GitLab or what GitLab does? For those that didn't raise their hand, it's totally fine. GitLab is a DevSecOps platform, but it's an open core platform, which means that a large part of it is MIT licensed. The other part is a GitLab license, but it's source available. So just think of it. You can run it on premise. You can run it on GitLab.com. But many people use it to do their repositories, projects, deployments, pipelines, etc. Now, okay, knowing that, we have a strategy and a mission, and our mission is that we believe that everyone can contribute and co-create the software that powers our world. That's a very large mission, but you can hear the word co-create in there, and that's also what we'll talk about in a bit. And my team basically tries to train and empower people to contribute back to GitLab. And so you might have heard of OSPOs, and OSPOs often try to incentivize people to contribute to open source, also regulate what kind of contributions are going out. We've heard a lot about Git proxy. We'll talk a bit about that in a bit. My job is actually to get inbound contributions. I'm trying to attract people to GitLab, and I have engineers that are responsible for creating a tooling that makes it easier, creating gamification platforms to make sure that you get some rewards, t-shirts, maybe gift cards, whatnot, to make that fun. Some of those engineers are here in the room. But the other thing that my team does, and that's what we did together, is we send people from GitLab engineers on site to the customer or to people that use GitLab. And we teach them how to basically make a change to GitLab itself. So that's fairly new, I think, and something that we should talk about in more depth. If you talk about myself, like who am I behind the director of contributor success, and I don't have a beard. I'm trying to grow it for this session, but it's not as much as yours. So I've always worked in open source my entire career. I've been part of a board of directors of the Drupal Association. So I'm very familiar with open source and community and those things. So with that, I'm sure, like I'm also curious, James, if you could tell me about the experience that you had or what you learned or what you saw when GitLab kind of asked you, hey, are you okay if we send an engineer to your office and that we teach you how to make changes to GitLab? And is that something you'd be interested in?
Yeah. So the story actually starts outside of the open source program office, which I run within NatWest with the team, who are also here. It actually starts within our engineering platforms team, who are the team who actually run GitLab for us inside NatWest. I was actually given a challenge. It was kind of like thrown to me. And the challenge was, we have some engineering use cases that we would like to contribute back into GitLab core. Hey, James, how can we do that? So how can, us as NatWest Group make that possible? So I knew that both Nick and Raymond and the team ran an initiative called Co-Create, which is the coming together of GitLab experts with partners of theirs to learn how to actually make those contributions. Because there's a lot of rigor that goes into being able to make a contribution into GitLab, because it's core infrastructure for a lot of open source and also partners of the firm. And so it's not like contributing into your regular GitHub repository where you can clone the repo, bring it down, and then make changes and then contribute it back up. There's an entire developer ecosystem that you need to engage with. And there are different methods in which you can do so. So one method is that you can clone the repo, bring down the environment, build it locally. And another method is that you can bring a container down and run it locally in a containerized environment. And so we were given a number of different options, and we were met through various different both in-person and also virtual sessions to learn how we could do this within a 5-day block of continuous engineering with the GitLab team inside NatWest. Right. So the first thing is that we are a bank. And, the very first thing that, when you work inside a bank is that you think, how are we actually going to make this possible? How do we get people actually through the gates in order to be able to do this? And how can we actually create an environment that, allows us to be able to contribute in this way? Now, luckily, since the open source program office has started, we've rewritten our open source contribution policy that brings a mechanism in that allows us to do this. Our open source contribution policy, recognizes that, inside the bank, there are mechanisms of contribution. And also, if we are running hackathon type events, there are different mechanisms that we can use as well. And so it gave us a good opportunity to run that decision tree and find, methods of contribution that make this possible. So that was kind of written into our contribution policy. And then it was, how are we going to make this possible? working with the GitLab team were able to bring equipment into NatWest that maybe some of our engineers didn't have, which was absolutely brilliant. So where we had gaps in the hardware needed, the GitLab team were able to bring that in and supplement that. So some of us were able to contribute because we had the hardware needed. Other, less proficient open source contributors didn't have it. And so their hands were held in order to be able to do so. And then prior to the event, Raymond jumped on a Zoom and said, hey, has anybody actually installed, the GitLab development environment? And there was a silence. And so I thought, okay, I'm the most senior person on this call. I'm going to have to do it on the call. And so the team actually talked us through how that's possible. So for me, co-create was stepping up to a challenge, doing something which is seemingly impossible and you have to figure it out, and then being handheld up until the point where the team actually landed in NatWest to do the actual event. And so it was kind of like a contribution partnership and education. And I hope that was okay.
It's totally okay, yeah.
So Nick, from GitLab side, what made you believe the co-create approach would work in a financial services organization like NatWest?
Yep. That's also a good question. Like, why would you do this? Why would any bank say, this is quite complex, I need to get people together, what's the point? I really, really believe in contributing to open source. And it's not just a belief, and I'll get to like why I really believe it also works for financial institutions. But there's research out there that if you consume open source, you're more effective. I think if we are all here, we're all consumers of open source, unless someone raises their hand and say, no, I'm totally against it. But that's probably not why you're here. The other research on top of it, and you can look it up, it's from Frank Nagel, it's a researcher at Harvard. They found that if you contribute to that same open source that you use on a daily basis, because GitLab is software that many organizations use on a daily basis, if you contribute back to that specific type of software, you become more efficient. And you think, oh, that's odd. It's actually not that odd. If you go back to ancient times, even you as a kid, you learn by doing. If you go into the mechanics of your car, you probably understand the car better, you'll drive it in a more efficient way. So contributing to open source that you use on a daily basis is a key selling point. Now, I really believe that organizations like NatWest, and they're very large, have this massive effect of making a single change that maybe has an impact to 10,000 people or more, it depends on what, and not just for an organization like them, but also for all the other users of GitLab. I also believe that this would work for finance institution because we wanted to make this work also on a legal basis. We understood that this is complex, and we also understood that it might take some time, and also that we wouldn't need any access to any of the data that the bank has. Like we don't want any of that. That's yeah, not feasible. So with that said, James was fairly quickly enthusiastic, and yeah, we made that work.
Absolutely. And so just to add on to your points, so there are a couple of us within NatWest, within the open source program office, who have contributed into open source. And so we kind of augmented ourselves. So both myself and Chris West, who may be here.
He's over there.
Yeah. Became part of, co-create. Chris led the initiative, and I kind of was in and around the team in order to, resolve any issues that needed to be resolved. Now, the actual team from the NatWest side, who was part of co-create, I would say that their contributions into open source prior to co-create were of interest, so maybe some people had, understood open source and maybe had been involved to some level, but not to the level where they had made, big contributions into a framework or, into a platform like this. by the end of the 5 days, because it was quite intense, Co-Create actually operated over 5 intense days where it wasn't just education. You know, we wanted to make sure that there were either use cases or problems or issues that needed to be resolved were able to be resolved through code commits, contribution, meaningful documentation, writing issues that, you know, or writing merge requests that made sense to the maintainers, because not only are we contributing the answer to a problem that's being asked for us to solve, but we've got to convince not only the maintainers, but also GitLab Duo, who is now one of your very first agents that you need to get through in order to even hit a maintainer, that what you're contributing makes sense and it actually hits the use case. Now, I thought that, you know, going through that type of rigor with a team from within an organization that's not done that before could be off-putting, but actually the team loved it. And, you know,
it was even eye-opening, I think, for some.
Yeah, so it was a real eye-opening experience of how engineers can come together and break outside of their organizational structure to be able to collaborate kind of across industry and also across internal teams where they've never done that before. And so we had people who were asking us, you know, how can we actually continue kind of making contributions in this way? And we've also got people who are involved in other areas of NatWest around, you know, diversity, equity and inclusion and career growth, who are saying, I was involved in Co-Create, you know, I was able to contribute meaningful contributions into GitLab. This could be a platform for other people to learn how to do this and bring a lot more relevance, you know, into their careers. And so, fair enough, the very first use case that we were trying to hit was, let's get something into GitLab Core. The unintentional kind of like consequence of that was kind of like a creative, you know, awakening of 5 engineers saying there's so much more that we can do in this open source space. And this is just our first entry point into that.
Yeah, even into career advancements, training people, how to empower them. I think that's amazing, this growth and development.
Yeah, it was very enlightening and it was really easy to engage with. So within Co-Create, so within the Linux Foundation, if you're a member of the LF, then you'll be familiar with DCO, so Developer Certificate of Origin, and also CCLAs, which is what you need to sign in order to contribute your intellectual property into the project as well. We were able to take the GitLab CCLA and run it through our legal team. And because we are very familiar with that type of agreement, we were even able to cover that base. And so everything that was moving from inside, you know, as a contribution into the core to the outside was covered through that legal kind of open disclosure to the legal team and permission to do so.
Yeah, right. Might take us here.
Yeah. So I'm lost in here.
That's fine. We prepared a couple of questions, so I'll help him for a second. But I think I want to maybe take what he said in terms of like how to have procedures within an organization to allow open source contributions to make that easier and go faster. Now, last week, I was in New York. I was at the United Nations Open Source Week. I don't know if you're familiar with United Nations Open Source Week, but for sure you've heard of the United Nations. And so it was a large room full of people, diplomats, techies. I was there, also a couple of colleagues of mine were there. But also if you look at the financial world, the World Bank was there. And I didn't really know what the World Bank did. I also think it's very different than a regular bank in that sense. But what stood out to me in that week was that they made a very clear statement. They said open source is the thing that really unites us. And as a World Bank, they had a mission to really share the software that they create with the world. Now, they basically shared also the story on how to do this. They could do this as a one-time thing, but they didn't. They took their time, as any diplomacy takes. United Nations takes time. They built procedures. They built a strategy, and they had a very clear plan of how to make projects open source. And they have a first project open source to do statistical analysis on, I think, World Bank data. The reason why this is so important is that, as James mentioned, if you don't have procedures, if you don't have that intentional mindset of sharing these things in the open, you will always bump into barriers. And like the second time you do an open source project, you do it again. And you will never be able to benefit from the acceleration of innovation that open source brings you. And we could talk to you 10,000 times that open source is really innovative and you should do it. But the only way to actually really do it is get started. And then if you're an engineer in a financial institution and there's no procedures or there's no policies to allow you to do so, you're blocked. So I think the future of open source within finance is really bright. But you do need these OSPO types of organizations that similar to what James is doing. So we'd love to understand, I think, also more from you, or maybe speak to James in how to set up such an organization within a financial institution.
Absolutely. And from what I understand, I don't know if I've lost my mic. Have I? From what I understand, the World Bank has also released its first open source tool. I mean, I don't know if you can talk more about that.
Well, I had to look it up, but it's like a metadata editor. It's under the MIT license. And let me read a little bit, because obviously I'm not their press secretary and I don't know much on that. And it seems it was a little bit created with AI, because I see a lot of hyphens in the text. But they created this open source software because they wanted to advance the bank's commitment to public good. The World Bank is here also for public goods, public infrastructure, digital public infrastructure. They want to be transparent and have the open science impact. I'm happy to maybe post on LinkedIn a bit more on that. Or if you come to me, I can let you read and maybe have some Q&A on that topic.
That's brilliant. So something that I'd like to add is that the primary purpose of Co-Create was to make contributions into the GitLab core, but we did actually leverage it as well for a secondary reason, and that is to bring the GitLab team together with us within NatWest to see if we can extend Git proxy into being able to make contributions into GitLab itself. So right now, Git proxy is a strategic tool for financial services firms to be able to make contributions safely into upstream open source repositories. But the way that it had been developed was that it needs to be into GitHub. But we see, strategically, if we need to be able to make contributions into any upstream open source repository, then we needed to, remove that barrier and allow those contributions to happen. So within the 5 days of us working together between NatWest, because we do contribute into the Git proxy core project, we came together with the GitLab team to understand what changes, needed to be made for Git proxy to be able to make contributions, into that upstream Git proxy repo.
Yeah, maybe to add there, is there anyone here that made a contribution to open source in the past? Have you done that from home or with other people? So who did that from home alone? And how many hours did you lose? Right, so I think to his story, the reason why we get together as a kind of a boot camp hackathon is to reduce the barrier of entry, and whether that's for GitLab or Git proxy, within those 5 days, we were able to actually get a pull request, a merge request out into the public that's now being reviewed to actually have that support for GitLab in Git proxy. I think if we would have stayed remote and stayed each on our own island, that would have been very, very difficult.
Absolutely. So I don't believe the pull request has been merged into Git proxy, but I think that it's, on its way to being reviewed.
The experts are there in the back because they don't want visibility, but over there.
Yeah, which is really cool. So both Raymond and Chris, who are in the back, alongside the co-create use cases, we're also working collaboratively on the Git proxy use case. And so hopefully in a matter of X amount of time, we'll have that pull request merged and, the ability to contribute into into GitLab and through Git proxy.
So we have a couple minutes left. I'm curious if there's any Q&A or questions that the audience might have. Things that you say. Oh, there's one. I'll bring it to you.
Thank you.
And then you will have to answer because I don't have a microphone.
Sure.
I just had a quick question around, given the recent news with obviously Marks and Spencer's and their cyber attacks, how do you make sure that you don't have any bad actors or attacks on your GitHub?
Right. So given you're the DevSecOps platform, maybe you'd like to go first on that.
So what you're saying is public contributions and try to understand if there's a bad actor. First of all, within GitLab, there's a bunch of review procedures. So maybe a bad actor can try to make a contribution, but it has to be reviewed. It's not that someone external can press the commit button and then suddenly it's deployed into GitLab.com and no one would ever know about it. So luckily we have a bunch of policies that are actually not that different from the policies and procedures you might have internally. In most large organizations, you try to at least have a second pair of eyes on something. And then within GitLab, only people that are employed at GitLab can press that button of merge.
Absolutely. And do you mind if I have a crack at answering that as well? You're all right with that? So when it comes to security, there are a number of different vectors at play. So it's really easy to look at the security issue that happened at Marks and Spencer's and kind of tie it down to open source. But actually, amongst those vectors, there's also like spear phishing, internal issues, where bad actors are actually part of the team. Security is actually very broad, and there are lots of different use cases that you need to look at. Within open source, we do need to look at open source supply chain security and all of the various different risks that are associated with that, and make sure that upstream open source projects are maintained and kept up to date, but then downstream, making sure that you keep up to date with the latest version or as close to the latest version of open source as you can. I know kind of like the speed in which open source is actually updated. It's almost like having a full-time internal team, but they're working in the open. In order to mitigate and remediate any open source risk internally, you've got to get your cadence of update going, because it's highly likely that that upstream project will have resolved that issue, hopefully. But when it comes to certain security use cases like Marks and Spencer's, that could have come in through a spear phishing campaign, or maybe a phishing campaign coming in through email where somebody's opened up a link that actually took somebody to a malware site. And I believe, I'm not entirely sure, that could have been a ransomware attack, which could have come through a different entry point. And so security is actually, a number of different vectors that you also need to be aware of. And not just open source, but, across the broad spectrum as well.
We can have a whole other session on that.
Yeah,
if you'd like.
exactly.
Yes.
No, thanks.
I think the last question, because then we're almost...
Yeah, hi. So my question was around more sustainability of open source, and maintainer burnout. We've recently seen, especially post-COVID, a lot of open source projects just wrapping up and going completely enterprise or completely just shutting down. What role do you think banks like ours and other financial institutions play in enabling open source contributions to be sustainable and maintainers? And where do you see that ecosystem developing in the financial institutions?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. I think consumers of open source also have an obligation to contribute and, become a pillar of, sustainability for those projects as well. And I think that there needs to be recognition when a project, that could have been, started with a number of maintainers has actually got to that point where it's actually being consumed further than they probably would have imagined it to be. So for me, there's a couple of things. There's having strategic recognition about what you are consuming and how you can actually support that project. And then there's also understanding that, there are foundations like, the Linux Foundation, the Apache Foundation, the Eclipse Foundation, where those strategic projects can also be contributed to. So they have almost like a community around them, like this community here, so those maintainers don't feel isolated. So I think it's important for individuals and also institutions to recognize that, but maybe also guide them into kind of like a community like this in order to get that support.
Yeah. And so that's one important aspect. The other thing that, and I'm not sure whether it's really relevant here in the UK, but you have the CRA Act that I think you've heard about this morning. Every consumer of open source, if you're a business, has a liability of the packages that they consume. So if there's a security problem that is found, you are responsible as the consumer for showing that you've done everything you can to fix it. And you can show it in multiple ways. Either you contribute to fix, or you kind of join a foundation with some package or something that kind of shows that it's in relation to the to how you consume that package. I think the other answer to your question is, if you have an open source package and you want to commercialize it, there's multiple business models out there. GitLab's business model is open core. And for some, it says, oh, it's not true open source. But on the other hand, like, we do then have the funds to maintain that project, and it's a business model like any other to that regard. And we can then provide security maintenance, and we try to avoid maintainer burnout because these people get paid, right? So I think there's multiple ways to answer your question, and we're still as a society trying to figure it out, I believe. And I think that brings us to the end of this Q&A. Thank you so much.
That's good. Thank you. Yeah.